Bloop, bloop, bloop. Cool. So I told so it's like a bunch of high school friends I almost had a bachelor party with, and they have no idea software engineering. So it was weird. I made a lot of jokes. I was like, what do you guys want to do next? I was like, all right, let's come up with a list, and then we'll push items onto the array. And they're like, and I was like, okay, that wasn't funny. And they didn't get it. Does anyone know who this guy is? The maker of JavaScript? Yeah, no, that is exactly correct. I'm just repeating because for the recording and for like everyone else who like possibly didn't hear you. But that is 100% correct. 10 points to Gryffindor. So this right here, does anyone know his name? All right, cool. Let me go blow this up, but like, not his face, right? So a little bit of history before we kind of dive into the language itself, and that is Brandon Eich, right? While I was working at Netscape, created JavaScript in like 10 days. So I would say for most of your Mod 2 project, plus another day or two, he built JavaScript. It's pretty intense, very intense. Which is why it works perfectly and there's nothing weird about the language whatsoever. Yes. Yes. Okay, in case that wasn't clear, this language is built in 10 days, and there's a lot of weird things about this language, more explicitly. All right, so just so you understand what's going on. And the idea is that, who here has ever been on a website back in like the early 90s where you were waiting for an email to come in or something, and you had to keep clicking refresh. You're like, hey, you sent that email? Yeah, I sent it. All right, cool. And you just like keep clicking refresh, waiting for it to come. Do you? All right. Okay. I guess we haven't solved the problem yet. What we were trying to solve was this idea that we can make network requests without a full page refresh. So if you're on Gmail, without clicking refresh, sometimes on the bottom corner here, it'll go, hey, you have one new message or something. Or like you'll see a new message come up in your inbox without having to hit refresh. And so what's actually happening there? Let's review this request response cycle. And so you're in the browser, you're on Gmail. What I want to happen is I want to fire off a request for new emails without actually doing a brand new GET request to /emails. It wants to hit the server, and it pulls in any new emails from the server, and that's the data here. And then it comes back in the response through the magic of the internet, the cloud, and it comes to your computer. Who has seen something like this before without a full page refresh, that you are getting additional data? Yeah? What's a good example? Bookface? Sure. Cool. Let's, okay, I'm actually just looking for an apartment, so sorry about that. That's embarrassing. What is it? I don't want you to see where I might live, so I'm just going to get rid of that, even though it's on the recording. Please don't check. All right. Cool. Let's go check out old Twitter. A good friend of mine, Coffee Dad. You guys know Coffee Dad? Oh, yeah. All right, so Coffee Dad is just like, for those that don't know, it's just a bot. And it's just what you would imagine like a dad getting coffee would talk about all the time. Hey, I'm getting coffee. I could really use some coffee. But sometimes it gets really dark. So hopefully we won't encounter any of that. But sometimes it gets really dark, you know? Like, I really miss my son. And you're like, and then it's all like, thinking about that car crash. You're like, oh, shit. And then the next one just like, man, that cup of coffee really cheered me up. And you're like, oh, whoa. Anyways, it's a bot. So the idea here is that I can take a look at this, right? This was one request. Take a look at this scroll bar here. And specifically, I want you to take a look at the bottom of the page. If I do this, bloop. Did you see that real quick? That little load action? Did I refresh the page? No. So in order to create a better user experience, at the bottom of the page, right, let's just describe what's happening because I want to build the process in learning how to implement new features. So do you remember when we did the auth and like the shopping cart? There's not a lot of new skills that you learn, but you learn how to do a new feature because you can break it down systematically and then Google each individual piece that you don't know. So just speaking in plain English, what is happening here in plain English? Yes, dynamic features. Technically, that's English. But what is actually happening? I'll start you off. Okay, kind of. Let me start you off by what I mean by plain English. If I scroll to the bottom of the page, what happens? It gets more stuff to scroll. That's the plain English of it, all right? So I know you're trying to use like some technical terms. I'm not as smart as you, so yes. Explain like I'm 5, right? Correct. That's a fail on me. Explain like I'm 5. What's happening? So let's do that knowing what we know about technology now. If the user scrolls to the bottom of the page, then what happens?
Probably gets some sort of request at the bottom, which makes it.
That's right. What's happening is I scroll to the bottom of the page and I make another network request. That hits the server, right? So what happens on this first full page refresh? I probably get, I don't know, 20 tweets, something like that. So if you really think back to Mod 1, is there a way to go into my database and select the first 20 of something in my database? Okay, cool. What if the user hits the bottom of the page and then it selects the next 20 and then it returns that data? And then all I have to do is essentially somehow figure out a way to add it to the website. That's the new feature that we don't know how to do right now. I need to be able to add it to the website somehow. And so with the power of JavaScript, you can do anything you want, right? Like I can right-click this, okay, and open up my inspector. You've seen me use this before, right? Cool. So we'll just go straight to the console. All right, what is this element right here? You could see this is a anchor tag, right? And it just says Coffee Dad. And right now, Chrome is doing me a huge favor by currently temporarily assigning it to something called $0. So that means that, and you'll learn more about this. Let me blow this up for you. Cool, where is that? So right now it's $0. If I were to, blah, 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 I don't need this. Boop. If I were to say $0, what would that be? Okay, that Chrome gives it a lot away, which is kind of terrible. I should turn that feature off, but it's fine. It's going to be just this anchor tag. And so I can see the anchor tag, and I can go, what is the inner text? It's Coffee Dad, which makes sense because that's what it says right here. I can, in fact, go inner text is your boy. Bloop! Whoa! So in JavaScript, we learn how to manipulate all of the text, everything that happens on the actual website, but it doesn't persist. It doesn't save to the database. Like if I were to refresh, I didn't hack Twitter, right? If I refreshed, your boy's not going to be there. It's going to be Coffee Dad. Does that make sense? And so you'll learn here in JavaScript how to manipulate the DOM, like the document object model. We'll get more into that. But basically what's displayed on the page in JavaScript. So if you learn that skill and you know how to make network requests for more data, you combine those two, and now you can create the feature of infinite scroll. Who feels a little bit more comfortable with just that process? Okay, that's really about it, right? If I click this button, this thing should happen. If I scroll, this thing should happen. Now it's a matter of figuring out how to understand the button click, how to intercept when the button click does something, and then also figuring out how to implement the feature. So we're going to walk through a lot of that all this week, and it'll be really fun. What's up?
Before you were talking about how like you used to have to like refresh your videos, how over like Gmail where you don't really like explicitly like press a button to signal a get request.
Right. That is done and is more like constantly fetching data from the server. So like every once in a while, it'll check to see, hey, is there any new messages here? So for example, if I have 100 messages, right? And so I go do select star from like, emails, right? The email table. And I check the length of it. And it gives me 100. I'm like, cool. If I make another request 3 seconds later and I check the length and it says 101, guess who has a new message? You know what I'm saying? And so there are ways to kind of think about that. That, by the way, in and of itself will not work because if you delete an email and then you get one, it's still 100. So that algorithm's not perfect. But the idea is there. That make sense?
So when you change the HTML and combo now, why wouldn't it persist? Because aren't you writing what the nature is?
Yes, we're going to get into that. The question is, why is it that when I refresh, it doesn't persist? Right? So we're going to get into it, but I want you to understand the full power of the full stack, so I'll give you just a slight short explanation. Who remembers in Rails when you did a show page and it was like @user.username? @user is coming from where? The database, right? So when I refresh that show page, where does it pull from? @user.username, the database. Here, all I'm doing is overwriting the text on the screen, but when I refresh, I do what? A get to /user/1, and it pulls from the database again. If I want it to change forever, I will have to make a request to the database that says @user.username is now equal to your boy. So when it refreshes and it pulls from the database again, it's going to pull your boy. Is that like starting to click? Some yes, some no. It's okay. It will make more sense as we continue. But let's get into like the weirdness of JavaScript and kind of the differences between JavaScript and Ruby. All right, check. Yes, yeet. Have some of you guys been saying like weird stuff now when you're at home? Smart? Okay. All right. All right, cool. Let's get into this a little bit because it's important to understand some of the history, and that is right now Ruby, as it's written, is what is known as a object-oriented language. Does anyone know what that means?
Gives us inheritance.
Sure.
Methods.
Inheritance, methods. Yes, the phrase in Ruby, like everything in Ruby is an object. So object-oriented programming has to deal with the fact that there's a lot of shared state. I can make a class with dog, and I can initialize it with a name and an age and a method like bark. Because all dogs should have some sort of name, age, and the ability to bark. Whether they choose to or not is up to them, or when they choose to use it too much is up to them. But the idea is that every single dog shares this sort of state. JavaScript is primarily known as a functional programming language. And that just means that there's not a lot of shared state. So in some of the labs that you'll go through, you'll start to see what that means in terms of not sharing state. And that will make more sense as we dive into very specifically functional programming in JavaScript. But just the idea that there's not a lot of shared state and that things are immutable. Does anyone know what that means? The opposite of mutable, very good. I like that definition. Immutable just means that you cannot change the data. Specifically, it's data type. So in JavaScript, if you set something to be an array, there are certain ways that you will set it to be an array so that you cannot change it to a number. Whereas in Ruby, you're like, hey, x is equal to 7. And then you're like, you know what, I'm bored of that. X is equal to an array of 4 items. And Ruby be like, cool. JavaScript be like, no, don't do that. That's not going to work. Cool? All right, so cool. In terms of like understanding a little bit more about like the history and how it applies today, is that because the language was written, do you think it was widely adopted immediately? No. Certain pockets would adopt it. And so because JavaScript affects the behavior of your website, and certain websites had it a long time ago, in the ye olden days, you ever see the message that says, this is best viewed in Netscape Navigator? This is best viewed in Internet Explorer? Yes, okay. That was why. Because imagine you wrote JavaScript that ran differently in one browser than from the next. So if I was trying to affect a way a button click, right, would change text on the screen, it would work perfectly in Netscape Navigator. And then I opened that exact same website in Internet Explorer, and I'd click the button, and nothing would happen. What kind of user experience is that? Terrible. It's terrible. So the European Computer Manufacturers Association, ECMA from now on, basically came together and was like, all right, look, we need to standardize this JavaScript because the user experience across the internet, across browsers, was too crazy and unreliable. And so they said, hey, when you use a dot for each, this is what it does. It doesn't do all that other crazy stuff that you try to do. This is the standard. This is what it does. When you use a dot map, this is what it does. If you want to add a new feature, like a dot filter, all right, cool. You need to submit it to me. I need to approve it. And then from here on, therefore, filter will do this across all browsers. And it's standardized it. Who feels a little bit more comfortable if you hear something like ECMA? So certain versions came out. The first version was known as like ES 2015 or ES6. It's kind of like the standard in which all browsers eventually can reliably and comfortably say, hey, I'm at that level. So in 2015 is when it got standardized. Yo, it is not far from that today. Does that make you feel like kind of weird? You know, like imagine just being like, you know, the toilet was invented like 3 years ago. I've been using that for forever. That's so crazy. And so basically, there are new features that come out every year. So ES6 came out in 2015. ES7 came out in 2017. So it's kind of like 1 year off. And each one of these features are implemented. And so you'll start to see newer features are not necessarily adopted by every browser. Cool? So like, this is a bad example, but let's say dot map works in 2015, and then dot filter doesn't work in 2017. Only certain browsers will use it. So like Firefox and Chrome will use dot filter, but if you were to use dot filter in Edge, it will break. That's not actually true, but that's the idea behind it. And so you'll start to see certain features like sort. Who knows if sort exists in JavaScript? You ever use dot sort in Ruby? Okay, there's no dot sort in JavaScript. You'll have to implement it yourself. I know. Great start to JavaScript, right? So this is important because the way you can solve this and not break the internet is that, let's just say you don't implement that feature. There is a way to take newer code, recognize it, and transpile it to a similar working version written in the old code. So who here has ever written their own dot map in Ruby? Right? Like, it's just, you def map, you create a new array, and you iterate through each one. You run dot each on the array. You do that mutation, and then you push it into the new array. Then you return the new array. Does that start to make sense? Great. If your browser doesn't use dot map, it will see dot map and run that code. And so you have to transpile it back into something that does work without that new feature. And so this is important because you'll start to see why you write certain code and how it works backwards. So here is a wild example. There's something called Babel, and what it will do is exactly that. It will take your new code, and if it doesn't work, if it's not part of the new standard, it will backwards compile it. It will transpile it to something that does work. So for example, here I have ES 2015 and a couple other checks in here. I can write a function. So far, so good. You guys aren't wildly confused by this. Function that's called that new. Is that the way to write JavaScript?
No.
That new?
Yeah.
Cool. And it takes in one argument. And all I'm going to do is, for argument's sake, just console log word. Cool. And this is what it transposes to.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Whoa, too much.
That's good.
Powerful. Cool. Nothing crazy, right? It looks the same. Some of you, as I walked by, had asked me, like, hey, isn't this like a class in Ruby where you did like a new person, whatever, and like this.name equals to name inside the constructor function I said mentioned to some of you? Cool. Let's take a look and see what class looks like in JavaScript. Let's just leave this here for funsies. I can have a class, and it's like person. Does anyone know how this is written? I'll just... Sorry. I want to show you this. So we used to use the Ruby docs for everything. When it comes to JavaScript, MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, I've shown you guys this website before for like intro to the internet, looking at the HTTP verbs. This is the Bible for JavaScript. Cool. And it looks like this. Class rectangle, right? Constructor you can think of as almost a literal one-for-one to initialize. And it looks that way. It takes in a couple arguments, and it sets, instead of the @instance variable, this dot whatever is equal to the argument. Let's see what this looks like inside of Babel. Let's just get rid of this in case it's not confusing enough. This is how to write it in ES 2015 because class does not exist in JavaScript. Who feels a little bit more comfortable about something like transpiling and why it happens? All right, just a one-sentence summary. Transpiling is writing code that doesn't exist in the newer version, so it works in the older version because not every browser implements JavaScript the same way, and they're not on the same version. That was like a decent explanation, I think.
So is this something that's in the newer versions, or is this like...
Class is in the newer versions, and this is how to write it in ES 2015. This is the ES6 version.
Will that do that automatically, or do you have to physically go back?
There's ways to transpile it, and we will talk more about that when we get to Mod 4. Something called like Webpack and Babel.
We should assume standard is ES.
You should assume the absolute standard is ES 2015, and you are authorized and allowed to use newer features, but you should double check to see if they work. And how would you imagine, if you were to create a website that says, hey, will this work? Or can I use it? What would you call your website?
Will this work? Sorry.
Yeah, just can I use, right? And so like, who has used CSS Flexbox? Cool, Flexbox, let's check it out. Oops, nope. All right, cool. So Internet Explorer does not support Flexbox for 11. BlackBerry, Opera doesn't support it. But let's take a look at CSS Grid. Cool. Internet Explorer kind of supports it. Subgrid, this is a newer feature. Nobody supports it. Interesting. What about Justify Content? If you use Edge, you might get some weird bugs. Cool. And this is kind of like the idea of like, now you know the internet is kind of like barely taped together. It's kind of scary. Welcome to the internet.
Is that like Chrome pretty much overclocks your CPU whenever you run?
It's part of it. Chrome does a lot of extra stuff that you're just like really impressed by once you like dig into it. Cool. All right, let's get into some JavaScript. All right. Sorry, but that's actually really important. It will be more useful as you get into React. Taking a picture for me? Oh, thanks. Remember this? You remember this?
Yeah.
Wow. The internet has come a long way. Long way. All right. So let's talk about these like data types. So there are 7 data types inside of JavaScript. Does anyone know how many there are in Ruby?
7, 6, 5, 4, 8.
Basically the blast off, right? Basically all the ones that you really need to know about were the string, the fixed num, right? Smort, right? the array, and the hash.
What about Boolean?
Boolean,
Float.
kind of. And then you had what? You had nil. Cool. All right. So these are important, all right? Everyone except number one's kind of important. So you have symbol, you have something called undefined, and you trust me when I tell you, I have seen, and I'm not saying it's like unoriginal, but I've seen multiple student blogs after they graduate literally write a blog on their JavaScript interview. And while I'm impressed by the blog, the idea here is that everything I'm telling you right now, I've seen in those blogs. And it's because, unfortunately, a lot of JavaScript interviews are just, they're trivia. And you have to know what they are. So it's very important that they ask you and you understand things like, what's the difference between undefined and null? Cool? Go ahead, answer. Yes, the answer is that undefined means that you've declared a variable. I don't know, I'm really warm. And null means that you've specifically assigned no value to this. So the follow-up question would be, why is that important? Let's take a look. Ready? JavaScript. Yeah.
Remember it was, it says non is also type, dev type.
Null is falsy. I'll get to that. Not a number is falsy. Yeah, I'll get to that. So the idea here is in Ruby, right? You can say x is equal to what? You can say nothing, right? Or can you not do that? Like if I were to go into my IRB and I want to say x and I just returned it, what would that be? This is undefined. So far, so good. Like it's just not defined, right? I can say x is equal to nil, and I can say x, and it's nil. Will nil break my code? Will this? Yeah, just stop running your code. So there is a particular reason where if you don't know what x is going to be, you could set it to be like, all right, look, I'm going to change it later. I'm going to use this variable. But for right now, I don't know what it is, so I'm going to set it to like an empty string or like a nil or whatever. Cool. So here, we can do the same thing, right? We can say like var x, and I do not assign it to anything. So what is x? X is undefined. This is useful to us because if JavaScript is going to look at a variable, store it and set it in memory and not assign it a value, then JavaScript recognized the variable and didn't assign it. That means if I see undefined, who assigned that value? Me or did the JavaScript engine? Just JavaScript engine. How many times have you run it through your labs over the weekend and you're like, undefined, son of a awesome, right? Was that useful to you? Very useful because you let JavaScript, the engine, tell you that something was undefined. If something came back as null, you'd be like, all right, who wrote that? Me or JavaScript? Me. So if something comes back as null, if you're a developer looking at somebody else's code, is there something wrong with that function? No, it was done on purpose. And that helps you not waste time looking into a function and try to debug it when that is the intended purpose.
Isn't it best practice not to do that?
No. If I want something specifically to not have a value, I will assign it to null, empty string, empty array, or empty object based on what I want that data type to be.
So undefined can be viewed as an error and null is viewed as intentional.
That is a way to utilize undefined, but undefined in and of itself is not an error.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense? You see how like you have to like start really weeding through the technical? So that is a very important question that you will definitely, very possibly, kind of, sort of, there's a chance you'll get that question on an interview. You feel a little bit more comfortable about this like undefined versus null and what they are. Check or hold. North, south, up, down. All right, cool. I picked up a lot of like armyisms when I came back, so if I'm like not making sense, just let me know. All right, Boolean. There's no change. True, false. And then that's it. And nil. All right, sorry. There wasn't anything sexy about that. All right, cool. The difference between number and fixed num is that number also includes the decimal. It is by default decimal placing versus Ruby where you have to specify if you want the decimal to be a float. Any questions on number? There's usually not, except sometimes when you have something that's not a number, and we're going to get to that. All right, string is string. There's no change, except how we interpolate. So like in Ruby, what we wanted to do is like x equals to like some string, and then you'd be like, I don't know, let's do this. Word equals to fancy word. And then I can have long string. Oops, that's not going to work. It's equal to this is a, and then you can string interpolate, right? Like word. Bloop. Yeah, and I don't know why I looked up as if that was going to impress you.
So, can you use the pound symbol here, or do you have to use the dollar sign?
You have to use a dollar sign, and that's my point. Strings are exactly the same, except how you interpolate. So in JavaScript, the way to interpolate is what is known as these backticks. Literally comes up as a string. So the backticks are right above, if you're on a US American keyboard, right above the tab. So if I wanted to, I can say like var, I don't know, Vera equals to mad cool, right? And twinning again. And then I can have another soups, all right, I don't know. I can have another var stringy, and that is equal to backticks. I can put like anything I want, right? This is a string. And then I interpolate with that money, this dollar sign, and then I can put in Vera. Undefined, cool. What is stringy though? So the backticks essentially are replacing like the double string, and then you just drop this dollar sign to interpolate. Are there any questions on just string interpolation here?
Can you just use backticks?
For strings?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In general?
Yeah. It's not best practice because the code has to transpile the backticks into a string, and there's a very slight memory and processing time. So if you don't need it, it's kind of like if you were running, and I were to tell you if you run this way, it shaves 0.4 seconds off your runtime. You'd be like, okay.
And what about like
Yeah.
double quotes or single quotes? Is that better?
There's no difference. There's no difference.
Before we get too far ahead, can we just quickly touch on what defines as true and false in JavaScript?
Yes, I will 100% get there.
So when you did the var, var, and var stringy, you set it to a value. The console is returning undefined still.
Correct.
Why did that defined variable?
So when I make a statement and I hit return, Chrome, when I do this, will attempt to evaluate what that means. And that evaluation of an expression of an assignment returns as undefined. Does that sound weird? In the same way that when you're in IRB, if you were to puts eat, right, it returns nil. But this is what it's doing. It's like console logging, but the evaluation of the put statement returns nil. Cool? Let's reveal our vote here. All right. I was doing that a lot obnoxiously over the weekend. Someone said something, hey, you guys want to go do this? I'm like, I'm going to reveal my vote here. Did not want to do that. And then the last thing is something known as an object. So not everything in JavaScript is an object, but a lot of things, more things than you would imagine or understand or believe currently, is an object. Okay? We're going to get into that. Sorry. All right. So I missed you guys. Yeah. So there's a lot of things here, right? There's something called constructors versus literals, and so here you can have like let, which we will get into var let const here in a second. Another num, just some variable, is equal to 1. You can have some num equal to the number, the object number, passing in the argument value 1, and then you can have some new number with the new keyword of number passing in 1, and they do not equal each other. These do, but these do not, and they're different. We were going to get into more of something what is known as a constructor, but let's take a look at what they return. Cool? So I'm just going to drop this there, and I'm going to take a look at this. Oops, just kidding. Bloop. Is that better? Can you see this both? So I can have a number passing in 7. Actually, I'm Chinese, so 8, for whatever reason, is a lucky number for us. And the culture. You're welcome. So I can have a new number passing in also 8. Look what it returns. It does not return the value 8. It instead returns something like this. It is a new number object that holds the value of 8. And it says something called primitive. And we're going to get to that here in a little bit as well. All right, just understand that it's a little bit different. Cool? Trust me when I tell you, like, a lot of these things are weird. And as you start to use them, they will start to make more sense. But I need to clarify the distinction at first. All right, so there's literally no difference between single and double in JavaScript. It's going to be the backticks for the interpolation. Check. All right. So the number, right? You have negatives. This is how you do exponents, right? You just drop that fat E in there. Floats, everything here falls under number. So you have negative, exponent, float. Something called not a number, which is ironically technically a number, which we could take a look at, right? So like, let's do this. Let's clear this out. I have 8. I have 9, whatever, right? Cool. I can type check it, type of, and then I can say, what is 9? Cool, it's a number, right? What is, I don't know, some var, like weird, is equal to 9 plus string e times 10. I don't know. I can't do that? Oh, I have to do this whole thing. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, wow. Where was I? That's not a number, right? You can't have 9 times e, a 9 plus the string e times 10. Like, what does that really evaluate to? So it must not be a number. So what is type of weird? A number, ironically. It's just a number object referring to the fact that this has no real value. Has anyone seen this in real life? I have. You ever like sit in the subway and you see like, oh, the 4 train is like 8 minutes away? Sometimes there's like an error in the calculation. It'll say the 4 train to East Cheshire Avenue. It'll say NAN. And now you know what it is. Someone did the calculation wrong and they just spit it out. Cool? I know. The more and more you learn about technology, the more you're like peeling back all the layers. So not a number is a number, but it means that it has no primitive number value. All right. All right, so the weird thing about the Boolean, even though it's still true and false, there are weird things that the Booleans will evaluate to. So false is false. Oh my God. 0, false. Empty string, false. In Ruby, in Ruby, these two are true. Null or nil, right? False. Undefined, false, which is very useful. And then not a number ultimately is falsy as well. Literally, if it's not one of these things, it's true. So you have to kind of, I don't tell you to memorize much. I really don't. You have to memorize this. There's nothing else I can tell you. There's no like secret like thing you can kind of, you can always reference it, but you should know these things. All right? Talked about undefined, we talked about null. I will talk about symbols, likely you will not remember, and that's okay. But a symbol is a special type of JavaScript object, or type rather, and we almost never use it. It is similar to how, you remember like the flash hash, we had a key of something? This right here is a symbol object, as opposed to the string something. JavaScript has something very similar, except it is what is known as not reflective. And that is a very weird thing to say right now, but I'm going to try my best to explain to you. When something is reflective, that means you can look at yourself and make determinations, right? Like without a mirror, I can't tell if my mascara is rubbing, right?
Yes.
For all the people that wear mascara, that was a bad example. If I had like crumbs on my face, and let's just say it was like small enough that I didn't really see it or feel it, if I looked in the mirror, I could be like, oh my God, oh, you ever like look in a mirror and you like go to your friends like, you let me walk around this booger in my nose this whole time? You didn't like see it or feel it, but in the reflection, you can look back at yourself and evaluate. In the same way that in an array, you have like 3 numbers. If I do dot each, I can look inside myself at each one of the numbers within the array. If I have a symbol, a JavaScript symbol within the array, it does not come up. It is not reflective. There's other ways to retrieve it, but it will not come under like traditional reflective methods. You don't have to fully understand that as much as you're just like, great, I cannot reference it in the traditional sense. That's why we don't really talk about it very much. It is a faster lookup, and there's things that you could do with it, but nothing that you will need unless you are a very advanced JavaScript developer. Cool? All right. All right, cool. This is very important. Something called primitives and non-primitives. And this is a big deal. All right. Primitives are passed by reference. I'm sorry, non-primitives are passed by reference, and primitives, right, are passed by value. So passed by reference and passed by value. Does anyone have an idea of what that means? Can you explain it well? Because if not, then I don't want to like overstep what you're saying. Yeah? You want to try?
Yeah.
Cool. What is passed by reference, passed by value?
So when you declare the variable and you pass it by the reference, the function has the reference as a value. So if you make any changes, or you'll literally change the value that was declared before.
Yeah.
When you pass by the value and you make any changes, you only make changes inside of the function, and the original value, the variable does not change. So if you like want to do some calculations without like changing your initial value, you pass it by the value.
Yeah.
Not perfect, but
Okay. All right. So here's my explanation of it. It was pretty good, but that's like your understanding. So for those that like want to like see some code, so you're at a disadvantage. Oh, sorry. All right. Let's take a look at this. Right. I got var 9. Cool. And that equals to 9. Lucky guess. If I were to do 9 plus plus, does anyone know what this is? It's basically, yeah, an incrementer, right? 9 plus 1. 9 equals to 9 plus 1. That's what this is doing. So what should I see if I type 9 again? Cool. This is known as a primitive, a value that is passed purely by its value, right? Here's what I mean. Now, we have something called objects in JavaScript, right? Let's take a look at a var, I don't know, teachers. I can have an array. Let's just do this, right? The name is going to be Ronnie. Cool. And I don't know. Ronnie, how old are you?
24.
Okay. I wasn't expecting that answer so fast, right? Cool. So we have just this object, teachers, right? Let's do this. What if I did teachers, and then I assigned this to be the value of something called not teachers. So far, so good? So what is, okay. Sorry, oof, I'm zoning out. This is what is known as like Yoda expressions. I was actually writing some good code the other day. I'll talk about it later. Not teachers equals to teachers. This is the actual assignment, not the comparator. So if I were to say not teachers, all right, it's the same as teachers because I literally assigned it to be the same thing. So far, so good. This is a typo error. All right. So far, so good. So not teachers is the same as teachers. If I were to do not teachers, and I were to add another key value pair, right, like Vera, and she equals to, cool? Well, let's take a look at not teachers. That makes sense. There's just literally an extra key value pair in there, right? Did I ever touch the teachers variable? What do you think that is? Weird. Because objects, right? So, sorry, I didn't explain. Anything that you think of as a hash in Ruby is essentially an object in JavaScript. They're just key value pairs. Cool? So, objects are passed by reference, not by value. Here's what I mean. I have a teacher's, right, object, and it is stored at memory 001. I'm going to create another variable called not teachers, and I'm going to assign it to be the same. What it's really doing is saying teachers, the value of teachers, which is like Roni and 24, is at memory 001. When I assign not teachers, all I'm saying is teachers and not teachers will now point to the same place in memory, 001. So when I altered and mutated not teachers, I changed what was in memory 001. So when I look at teachers again, and it points to memory 001, I will get the same object back. They are passed by reference. They are both referencing the same point in memory. This is extremely difficult to understand, master initially. So if it's a little weird, but that analogy made sense to you, that's where I need you to be.
So what is the point of having essentially two variables pointing to the same thing?
That is a very good question, and that will make so much more sense when we start referencing and updating the HTML on the page. As well as the weird things with JavaScript, I will constantly point out why that's important, but to try to explain it now without a good example, in the middle of trying to do something, it will be very hard. Just understand that objects are passed by reference. So who feels okay the fact that anytime I assign something, it's pointing to the same place in memory. So if I alter something else, anything that's pointing to that place in memory will also be altered. Okay, cool. Now you'll probably want to know like what's a primitive and what's a not primitive, right? Okay. Functions are objects. All right. So this is really what it is. Everything that is an object is passed by reference, so the pointing in memory. Everything else is a not primitive. I mean, everything else is a primitive. Sorry. Meaning your strings, your numbers, your booleans, all primitive. They work exactly like how you think they would work. Cool? So the only thing that's passed by reference, the non-primitives, are objects. So if I said like, hey, this is 9, and then I messed around with it, and I asked for 9 again, it would be what I think it is. All right. So objects, however, like I said, are more encompassing than they initially appear. So there's no such thing as a data type of array inside JavaScript. It is a special type of object. It's just a form of an object. So like, for example, if I were to say type of, and I were to put in this object with a key that points to a value of value. God, I'm lazy. What the? It thinks it's a variable, yeah. It's an object. If I were to also do it with an array, Bloop, bloop, bloop. It's an object. Functions are also objects in JavaScript. Yeah.
So it's this object of the class array and object of class.
Classes don't really exist in JavaScript.
No.
No, not really. And it's a little weird to kind of understand that. But that's actually not important right now, and you'll be surprised why later. So an array is a type of object. So that being said, are arrays passed by value or passed by reference? Who feels it's value? Who feels it's reference? Smart, cool. All right. So if I were to just randomly declare like an open object like this, if I were to just go, hey, instead of saying object.new and then giving it key value pairs, I was just literally making a brand new object that points to a, let's just put a key in here, right? Table, and that is, sorry, you had to rearrange the room. Cool. This is a object literal. I'm literally making a new object without doing object.new. In the same way that you can make literally a brand new array by doing this, as opposed to array.new, right, in Ruby. If you were to talk about that, this is a plain old JavaScript object. So if you hear the phrase Pojo, which you will basically never hear me say, but if somebody else who is a advanced JavaScript developer was like, oh, it's a Pojo, you will have at least heard it and know what that means. It's just a plain old JavaScript object, just a bunch of key value pairs. Cool? I don't talk like that. I don't enjoy confusing people for no reason or using terminology because it's just extra terminology. All right. So there are two ways to access an object's keys, right? And that is, I like doing this, right? Like var, like random, is equal to an object with a pizza pointing to a value of hut. Cool? I don't know why I like this stuff. There's a way to get pizza, the key, and that is the way that you're used to, right? And that is what is known as the bracket notation. So I can do that. I can also ask for it in the dot notation, very similar to how you've seen some methods being called in Ruby. Cool? There's interesting differences between these two, and they're very important. And that is this right here and this right here can be tricky. JavaScript, this is the default way to do it. This is the default way in Ruby. This is the JavaScript way. Technically, both are correct, but if you're going to start writing good JavaScript, use the dot notation. Cool? Like any JavaScript developer will see this and be like, oh, okay, cool. You must be coming from a different programming language. But inherent JavaScript development will look like this. This is just best practice. Very few times I will actually tell you what best practice is in JavaScript because it's so widely different amongst different people. But this is a standard. You guys look like you want a break.
25 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Just.
So you have what you were doing, but you always declare a variable with var, and every lesson it says don't use var ever.
Yes, it is weird.
So why don't you use
I will talk more about var, let, and const here in a little bit, but let's take a break. All right. So we have arrays and we have like the hash, which we know are objects. What else is also an object is a function, all right, which is kind of weird, right? So you have something like this, like you could tell that I wrote like some of this README. Right, cool. I have a function called I like pancakes. All it does is log. I can, and this is important, super important, right? Is definition versus invocation. Something that we did not do in Ruby and that we do not do in Ruby because functions are objects, whereas methods in Ruby are not treated the same way as they are in JavaScript. And so you're going to learn a lot of terminology, and I promise you, unless you use or say them or reread the definition, it will slip. And again, these interview questions, unfortunately, just a bunch of trivia. I don't believe in it, but Here's the idea. This is just the definition, right? Here I've declared the function. If I simply say I like pancakes, what will come back? No, I definitely defined it because here's the declaration. It is simply the definition of the function. Now, I can also add these bananas and invoke it. This is saying run the function. In Ruby, when you invoke the method, automatically bananas are put in, even if there is no argument. You have to put the bananas to invoke. In JavaScript, it is inherently invoked in Ruby.
What is the VN2849:2? Is that like time or?
V84929.
Trace 2 is the line number.
I don't understand. Oh, this. Got it. Okay. This is something that Chrome adds in if you wanted to use the debugger. It's essentially the binding.pry for Chrome and JavaScript. And so I'll explain. So the way JavaScript is read, who did all the labs? Specifically the one that showed you how your JavaScript gets executed. And it gets executed in two parts. If you have not watched that video, please do nothing else. Watch the video. It's like a 3-hour JavaScript, the weird parts. Okay. That should have been deployed to you at least this morning. Yeah, watch that video. I'll send you a direct link to it afterwards, but it will tell you how your JavaScript runs. There's like a read phase and then an execution phase. Does this sound familiar at all? Okay, maybe it wasn't 3 hours. Oh, you read it? Okay, got it. So the virtual machine debugger Chrome will like read your JavaScript code and then evaluate it. And so this is kind of like the line that Chrome is using within its virtual machine after it's read your code, stored it into memory, and then executed it. If you did not understand that, that's okay. I wanted to answer your question. Don't worry about it. All right. So who feels comfortable with definition versus invocation? You will very, very frequently mix the two up, but you need to know which one is which, especially as you can say it out loud. Like, hey, if I would tell you, did you invoke it? You should at least know what I'm asking you. And that is like, oh, I just wrote it and I forgot to put the bananas or whatever to actually execute the function. Yeah.
So functions are objects, actions are objects, and are those invocation bananas? Is that what tells JavaScript that that's actually a block of code and like not a hash?
It doesn't tell.
It's the same, right?
Yeah, the question is the parentheses, right? I call them bananas, so sorry you got me for your JavaScript instructor. So the bananas, right? The difference between a plain old JavaScript object and a function is that it has a block of executable code. That's the only difference. And if it has that block of executable code, then you can invoke it, and it is a function. So for example, I can do something like var, right, not a function, and I can assign it to be a plain old JavaScript object, and that is going to be dolphin at a key of emulator. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. Cool? Right, very good. So not a function is a plain old JavaScript object. I'll clear this for you, right? Not a function is not a function. Wow. Cool. But I like pancakes is a function, so it can execute that code. That being said, right, not a function has key value pairs. It is in fact, a function is in fact an object because I like pancakes. I can do, hey, this is a key. I'm adding you. So if I were to say, I like pancakes, dot hey, it will return you. If I were to console and ask for all of its keys, I can see this function has key value pairs attached to it. Oh. Yes, they're just objects. Special type of objects that have invocable code.
So where's the code? How do you prototype or?
Kind of, but not really. There's things in here, but it gets kind of messy. It gets really messy. I forget where it's actually located in and of itself, but you just ask for the definition. Yeah?
I don't know if it's too early, but what is a prototype?
Prototype, it is too early, but the only thing you really need to understand is that is how JavaScript does its version of inheritance. So there's no such thing as like class Coolio, okay? And then like that inherits from like wrapper or whatever. Was that somebody's laugh? Nice. All right. Cool. Cool. All right. All right. So we talked about type checking, right? So a quick note about doing labs. In Mod 2, I said Capybara was testing for behavior, and there's weird isms to it that force you to write specific labels, attach IDs, that allow Capybara to do its thing. Mod 1 specifically, it was very good for testing because it was just a language. Mod 3, again, is just language. So I expect you to pass most, if not all, the tests, again, for Mod 3. So there's kind of that switch. I just want that to be explicit. And so you're not just like doing something like, oh, that kind of worked, and then just skipping it. You have to like actually pass the tests and then come by if you're not passing. There's a particular reason. And I just want you to understand the JavaScript that you're writing. Are there any questions on just like the labs and the mentality for labs now, going from 2 to 3, and how it's basically the same mindset and shift back into 1? I was like a mouthful.
There were a couple labs that just didn't work.
And the labs, there are a couple labs that I would describe as needs improvement. Those labs, again, if you're not passing for whatever reason, come to us and we'll explain why, or we'll at least try to hear your attempt to explain why. Interesting. All right, well, show me afterwards.
I think that's for all of us.
Okay, then the lab's probably needs improvement. Yeah? All right, so this is the first time we will actually start to judge you based on the code that you write. So like if you watch a lot of the code that I write, there's like all this proper indentation, right? Try commenting your code. I will start doing it more and more in this series of lectures, but your indentation is important. If I see code where it's like this, function, and then an argument, and then a block, and then there's like code here, and then there's like nested code for this. This is also a function, and then like you write it here. I will send you away. You're like, hey, this doesn't work, and I'm like, I can't read this either. Fix your indentation and come back, right? This is the point where like we're really trying to level up your code, so it has nothing to do with trying to be offensive or aggressive as much as it is literally our job to make you better developers, and part of that is good indentation, good code commenting, and things of that nature. So to practice commenting is if you have a question, write it in line. So if you have no idea what this does, you can just be like, okay, nested function, no idea. Sometimes if you're lucky, or if you're smart rather, you can do this, to do. And then like you can ask something about this. Or if you learn something, like if I teach you a new thing and it's on your personal code, you can just be like, this is what it does. Function should return blah, 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 accepts callback, something like that, like comment your code. So commenting and indentation is really important at this point. And as we will start enforcing that, because you're no longer worrying about like lower level things, and we're trying to like advance you. Are there any questions as to like code cleanliness, expectations for labs? Functions are objects. Objects are passed by reference. Primitives are passed by values. What are primitives? The data types. Is an empty string true or false in JavaScript?
False.
What about 0?
False.
Cool. All right, that's all I have for you this morning. if you do not indent your code, this is what winds up happening.